I'm DC.
And I'm Michael.
And you're listening to the Monster Guys podcast. Every monster was a man first. Edward Albee, Tiny Alice. There is no shortage of horror when reading through the history and the stories associated with the man known as Gilles de Montmorency Laval, more popularly known as Gilles de Rais. Welcome to another edition of Monsters Among Us, our month-long series in October on the Monster Guys podcast. Michael, tonight we talk about a man who is the subject of many a script, song, novel, graphic novel, and screenplay. He's been referenced by authors such as Neil Gaiman. He's been sung about by bands such as the Pet Shop Boys to Cradle of Filth. And he's been the subject of several anime and manga series, television shows, films, and is a part of the popular video game Castlevania 64 and its sequel, Castlevania Legacy of Darkness.
Both fantastic games.
Both fantastic games. He is also, before anybody gets too excited about the guy, known as a serial killer, a serial rapist, a pedophile, a hebephile, an ephebophile, a necrophiliac, and a proxy killer. Now, I don't think you have to be all those things to be popularized in music or literature or games these days, but this guy did this. And at the end of the podcast, talking about him today, we're going to throw a little twist for people to consider after we tell the alleged history of Gilles de Rais. Before we get too far into him, though, quick announcement. Next week, we will not have a podcast. It's the week of Halloween. We're going to take that week off, take a little bit of a break. Then we'll come back in the beginning of November with part 2 of our talk with Ellie Haskin. If you remember, back in Strange September, the very beginning of September, we spoke with Ellie Haskin of Encounters Cast about all kinds of things. Aliens, UFOs, laser gun-toting goblins in Kentucky. It was a wild ride.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, with our conversation with her. But it's not over with. We have another conversation to finish up with her, and then we've got some more surprises in the month of November. So we take a week off next week for Halloween, as all good people should. We're going to rest and enjoy the holiday week, come back with an exciting November. So stay tuned for that. Michael, Gilles de Rais, interesting life. No matter which way you cut it, it's a fascinating study into the human mind and the human heart, a man who was lauded for his military accomplishments, who was actually presented with several awards of the highest honor, several positions and titles of the highest honor, and amassed great wealth because of his influence, was actually the personal protector of Joan of Arc. Just a number of accolades down the line can be attributed to his name until things went bad. And when they went bad, they went really bad.
Which is, funnily enough, or maybe not funny, but interestingly enough, not long after Joan of Arc died.
Yeah, shortly after her death, this guy, he jumps off the rails of the crazy train, to quote another very interesting person. Who, as far as I know, is not a criminal. I don't know, but I love his music nonetheless.
I think he bit the head off of a bat once.
Yeah, so they say.
Okay. But nowhere near as bad, so.
But Gilles de Rais, let's talk about this guy. We have actually quite a bit of information, quite a bit of history documented about his life all the way back through childhood. Where do we start with this guy?
Well, I want to point out real quick. We were talking a few minutes before the start of this episode actually about how there are actually a lot of parallels between Gilles de Rais and the first episode of this series, or the topic of the first episode of this series, Elizabeth Bathory.
Yeah, the Blood Countess.
So I guess we need to start with his childhood. I want to point out, somebody had said that he was debatably the world's first serial killer. I don't for a second believe that. There are multiple people like this throughout history, but he does have almost all of the marks and all of the traits of a serial killer.
Yeah, somebody also said that he was the original Bluebeard.
Yes.
One of the titles given to him, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. I don't want to spoil anything, but there's debate surrounding that as well.
Which ties that as well to our episode of Tilly Clemec.
Yeah, the Lady Bluebeards from last week, I think. Yeah,
which I found funny. So, yeah. So as a child, he was born Gilles de Montmorency Laval. Quite a mouthful.
You say that French pretty good there.
That is the easiest Montmorency. That looks like the easiest French word.
Warning, folks, we are not
of
French
tonight.
We may sound more like Monty Python than
very true.
Good French accenteurs.
So,
is that a word?
I don't know.
It is now.
So with that in mind, we'll delve into his childhood.
All right.
He had it pretty good starting out. His family was very rich. His father and his mother both came from very rich families. They married for the purpose of becoming even more rich, which they did. That being said, we have a lot of these characters throughout history where, they have rich parents, but their parents turn out to be strict or weird or mean or something. But actually, his father was known as a pretty kind dude. Gilles de Rais' father actually spent quite a lot of attention in making sure that he had a lot of studies. By the time he was 7 years old, he was fluent in Latin and in Greek, able to read and write it from what I understand. Latin at that time was the language of the nobles, so he was already fluent in a powerful language. But he was given many studies of a scientific nature, very similar to Bathory again. But he was also surrounded by art and wealth, so he grew up with this appreciation of very beautiful things. I would go so far as to point out, I think one person had talked about how one of their castles actually had jade floor, which to me just sounds ridiculously extravagant. So the castles that he grew up in were said to be absolutely stunning and absolutely beautiful.
Probably plays quite a bit into his later lifestyle.
It does. And we'll see this to be a pattern, not just through his darker moments, but through everything in his life. So this is what he grew up with. And he was apparently very smart. Unfortunately, in 1415, we see the first big turn in Gilles de Rais' life.
Well, let me point out then for parents listening, if you don't want your children to grow up to be spoiled little serial killers, don't install jade floors in your home. It's just a pattern that we found through this series.
Doesn't even sound comfortable.
I guess not.
So in 1415, he goes on a hunting trip with his father. And unfortunately, his father's hunting a boar. The boar, I guess, gets the better angle and actually gores his father. And what we find out is that Gilles de Rais then watches his father die slowly and painfully. There wasn't a whole lot he could do. There was not a whole lot of medical attention that could be had back then for goring by boar. So this was...
Nor today.
Obviously.
You get crossed by one of those suckers, you're kind of out of luck.
True. They're pretty nasty. So obviously this was a very traumatic experience for him, especially as we know, his father having spent so much time and effort making sure that Gilles had the very best of everything, from education to just lifestyle. What makes things even worse is that his mother mysteriously dies 6 months later. We don't know as much about his mother as we do about his father, but again, for all intents and purposes, as far as we know, she was a kind person. But now, at 11 years old, Gilles de Rais is an orphan. He also has a 1-year-old brother, so obviously not a great place to be in life early on. Now, his father wanted Gilles to, should anything ever happen to them, his father had written into the will that he should go stay with a certain cousin. However, his maternal grandfather, a man by the name of Jean de Cran, and I probably butchered that, but this guy actually...
Jean de Craon.
That, yes. I keep
I
on
can
wanting
do
to
French
say
pretty good.
I want to say crayon, but I know that's not correct.
Your grandfather, the crayon guy. I wonder if he has... No, probably not.
Probably not. Hopefully not, because this guy was a jerk, actually.
Jean de Crayon.
Yes, he was known for...
I've been to France. You know, I've traveled
Is that how
France
you speak
kind
so
of
well the
extensively, and
Francois?
that's why I can do those words so well.
The wee wee. So he was known as being kind of a jerk. He impeded on other people's property. He bullied them out of their wealth and their property. He was known for being a scheming individual. He was
This is his grandfather.
Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
And he was also known. I mentioned how at the age of 7, Gilles already knew how to speak and read Latin, the language of, nobles at that time. Crayon did not have any interest in that. He didn't want anything to do with it. He was very openly against books, which makes me wonder how he got away with a lot of his schemes. He seemed to be pretty sharp in those. This is the man that Gilles would then grow up underneath. To tell you what this guy was like, he basically wanted to take Gilles under his wing because Gilles had just acquired, due to his parents' death, a lot of wealth and power and land. And this 11-year-old kid doesn't really have any say in the matter, as his grandfather basically takes over all of that. He goes on to try to marry Gilles de Rais off to two different girls that are, they come from very wealthy families. I believe one was actually something of a princess, if I remember correctly, for the desire of more money and power. He fails at both of these. In 1420, he tries again. Crayon forcefully finds this girl, who is actually a fourth cousin of Gilles de Rais, and he finds her while she's out riding. Her father has recently died, so she's kind of easy to take advantage of, and Crayon and some of his cronies kidnap her and take her to a monk with Gilles, and he forces the two to get married. At the time, this was actually frowned upon because fourth cousins were not supposed to get married. So this was technically an illegal thing to do back then. It goes through anyways, and now you have more power and wealth being accumulated, which we'll see play into things later on as well. So this is a forced marriage between the two. By all accounts, Gilles de Rais did not have any interest in his new wife. He's not very fond of her from the very beginning, though. Stepping back a bit, it's suggested by some that he was not very fond of women in general, and he was a little bit of a bully. Having grown up under Crayon at that point, Crayon would put on these mock courts. He would gather up a bunch of servant boys and create this setting where Gilles de Rais would be kind of this, almost like a mini king. I imagine this as being some sort of noble tea time for this kid at this point. What would happen behind Crayon's back was that he would actually start bullying and beating up these servant boys. So he had this penchant for domination already starting. And he had no interest in his new wife, Catherine, as a parallel happening at that time. So within the next 5 years, he joins the French army. The 100-Year War is going on at this time, and that's a pretty traumatic event for everybody, obviously. The English and the French are fighting to such extents that the English would actually come in on horseback and raid entire villages, basically burn and kill and maim anyone that they can see, just so that they can spread fear and chaos and disorder. Both the English and the French were laying claim to different parts of France because of political ties that had been made through marriages and political heirs earlier on. So a lot of upheaval going on at that time. Gilles de Rais joins the French army and quickly gains favor due to his recklessness on the battlefield. He was seen as a very brave and wild warrior that would throw himself into the fray and was able to fend off a lot of his attackers in the midst of that. So he gains favor, and in 1425, he's actually introduced into Charles VII's court. Charles VII, at this point, is the Dauphin of France. He is not a king yet, but by some people's standards should have been the king. He was said by other people to be an illegitimate son of the queen, I believe, so there was a big mix-up, toss-up there.
There's always some kind of toss-up in these matters.
Yeah, there's a lot of politics that go into this early part of his life. And what's interesting is that I say the early part of his life, it's kind of the majority of his life, because as we find out later on, he doesn't have much after the war either. But enter Joan of Arc. this 17-year-old girl that comes in prophesying things that come true on the battlefield and walking up to Charles VII and saying basically that God told me I needed to make sure you are coordinated and made king. So she tells him, I am going to make you king, or I'm going to see that you become king. Pretty bold statement, especially for a peasant girl at that time. Remember as well, we kind of talked about this in the Bathory episode, that people, commoners at this time, were seen as more of property, more as cattle than actual people. So this was kind of a slap in the face to a lot of people in that court. A lot of people, including Charles VII himself, had no interest in her at first. However, we see that Gilles de Rais was immediately somebody who supported her. He was kind of taken with the fact that she prophesied these things and seemed to produce small miracles. I think in one anecdote, he actually is said to have seen her pray for the change in the wind during a certain battle, and that wind did shift, according to the old legends and lore. So, he immediately was enthralled with her as a person, and he would actually go on to become her bodyguard of sorts in battle. So after some reluctance, Charles VII kind of allowed her to become part of the army, if you will. He did not have a lot going for him at the time. They were basically losing the battle in several areas. One of those areas specifically being Orleans, or Orleans, as we say here. Orleans had been besieged for quite some time, and the battle was very quickly being lost when Joan of Arc and Gilles de Rais kind of strolled in and within a couple of days turned the battle around. It was actually something that was said to be an impossible feat, something miraculous, because the English were basically, they had already won. They had already set up different places on the battlefield as well that were impregnable. And you see this 17-year-old girl and a new commander of sorts come into the battlefield, and it said within that couple of days, the English just they retreated in such a way that they literally just walked away from the battlefield. They gave up.
Yeah, and it was during this time that he becomes a commander in the French army. And it was during this time as well that Charles is made King of France and in turn promotes Gilles to the Marshal of France. And that's kind of equivalent to becoming a 5-star general in our U.S. Army or military today. So he was very quickly and at a very young age promoted to, again, like we said earlier, one of very high honor and position. And then following some of that, he and Joan of Arc decide to march for Paris. And that's when things begin to turn in the timeline of his own history, which leads him down a very dark path.
Yeah. Paris was another kind of lost cause at that time. So following the Battle of Orleans, or the Siege of Orleans, Joan of Arc and Gilles de Rais kind of go into Paris with the same mindset that they're just going to be able to win this battle. What happens instead is that Joan of Arc is actually injured. She does some pretty heroic things. She's known for saving the life of one guy in particular, whose name I can't remember at this time, but he talks about her very gratefully. In that same process, I believe she's hit in the head with a piece of debris from a trebuchet or something and sustains a bit of an injury. She doesn't die from this, but she is hurt. At that same time, the king's advisors counseled Charles to call Gilles de Rais back because they didn't want both Joan of Arc and Gilles de Rais being captured or killed in battle. As we know, Joan of Arc is actually captured, and it's kind of strange that it comes after the separation from Gilles de Rais. So she's captured, he's been called back to the king. He actually goes on a couple of rescue missions to try to save her, but the English threaten him specifically, saying, if you try this again, we are just going to put her in a bag and throw her in the river and she'll just be dead. So he backs off. Unfortunately, we know the story where she is later on convicted as a witch and for several other things, really, and burned at the stake. This seems to hit him pretty hard. After this, he's still in the war, I think until 1435, but he's not the same. He's not as reckless and as brave as he once was. In fact, in one specific battle, he actually sends his brother instead to go in his place. And so after this, the king, I think, kind of figures out that his heart's not in it anymore and dismisses him from the war in 1435. And this is where things start to change once more. Whereas things have been going downhill for a while now, this is where he really kind of twists off of his end. So it's important to note that he comes home a war hero, but I'd like to point out that his wife and his only daughter actually leave the castle, and different accounts say that they fled from him. One account says that he sent them away. He does decree to her that he will never have sex with her or another woman again before she leaves, and he kind of goes on some weird turn of events at that point.
Well, and it's at this point that he's no longer in the military, he goes bankrupt, and he begins selling off his properties to support an extravagant lifestyle, going back to that jade floor as a child and all the extravagance that his father lavished upon him. He picks that up and begins selling off properties to support this lifestyle. It ends up becoming such a problem that there's a royal edict that is declared that denounces Ray and prohibits him from selling any further property. So all of that mixed with a mentality that is already deteriorating, we start to see his life unravel in terms of his criminal activities.
And there are a few things adding to this boiling pot as well right now. Number one, I didn't know about the whole royal edict thing. That had to have been a kind of a slap in the face.
Well, yeah, and I'm just kind of sitting here thinking, how does that happen?
And especially considering that he was part of Charles VII's court. You know, Charles actually promoted him to being the Marshal of France, and then to have a royal edict passed down a couple of years later that denounce him, that's kind of harsh.
Yeah, and that's not the first time he's denounced, because his grandfather denounced him as well and tried to take measures against him because of his lifestyle and because he disagreed with his extravagance and all the things that he was involved in. His grandfather disowned him, basically said, take a hike.
To the point that when he died, he left his breastplate and his sword to Gilles de Rais' younger brother instead of Gilles de Rais.
Which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a royal
slap in the face.
Pun definitely intended. Royal slap in the face.
Yeah. So it was definitely a way of saying, you know, I don't see you as basically the child that I raised. Probably stung a little bit. Now, before and during this time, it should be noted that some of the stuff that he was spending so much money on were things like music and literature that he was commissioning for people to do. You know, a higher staff in his house. He was known as well for having this production that went on for 5 years, this stage play basically called The Siege of Orleans, that was based on, you know, him and Joan of Arc. It was supposed to paint them both as heroes and as this miraculous pair, basically. During this time, I think a little bit later, actually, he spent a lot of money creating what was known as the Chapel of Holy Innocence. He himself officiated some of the masses in robes that he designed and created, and he would also handpick the choir of boys that would sing in this chapel.
Yeah, and as well, remember, for all that he was military, for all that he was criminal, he was also very publicly religious.
Yes, he was.
And he placed a great deal of emphasis on the aspect of faith in his life. So this commissioning or construction of the Church of Holy Innocence was not just a thing to do. It was actually a public declaration of his faith mixed in with everything else.
It was, and to go back to Joan of Arc for a second, I think this was actually a big thing for him, whereas a lot of other people had issues with her claims that God himself gave her this decree and that she spoke with the saints. Gilles de Rais took that and ran with it pretty heavily, and I don't think he did that for political reasons, or it doesn't seem like he did that just for show. It seems like he genuinely loved the fact that she was connected with that higher power. So he took that heavily to heart. And you can kind of see, you know, in the creation of the Chapel of Holy Innocence and the sermon of sorts that he gives later on in his life, that he was pretty genuine in his belief, even though he didn't follow it very well. So we have all of this going on. Some people say that the killing started somewhere in this time. Some people say that the killing started after his grandfather died. There is another story that kind of goes along with this. As he starts spending more and more money on this extravagant lifestyle, he turns to alchemy in order to get gold back and to regain some of his lost wealth. And it should be noted that this is not the first time he's dabbled in magic and the dark arts, if you will, or black magic, but it's the first time that he goes heavily into it. Alchemy itself not being a black magic or a dark art, if you will.
Yeah, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, he was attempting to summon a demon in order to create this gold.
Yes.
So it wasn't just about the traditional practice of alchemy or the historical side of that, but he was also being influenced by one person particularly to summon a demon that he was led to believe would lavish him with gold.
Yes. And he actually sought this person out because alchemy was not doing it. It was not cutting it.
Right.
So he sought this person out who was a former priest, a very handsome Italian man named Prelati, which sounds like a flavor of gelato.
We're going to go with that.
I don't know. Maybe I just really want gelato
I'm
right
going
now.
to develop a new flavor of gelato named Prelati.
So together,
and when you eat the gelato, it will summon a demon. So you probably shouldn't eat it.
Let's not do that. Well, I don't know. It might not actually summon a demon because everything that Prelati told Gilles de Rais to do
never really happened.
Yeah. Some people regard him as a con man for this. Others believe that he was just manipulating Gilles de Rais the entire time.
Well, he was a former priest.
Yeah.
Turned con man.
It definitely seems like it.
There are no parallels to him in modern life, are there?
Not at all. So he gives the details on how to summon this demon named Baron. None of this works. So,
well, let's remember, too, that one of the things that supposedly this demon Baron says, I wonder, is that the French name of some Latin demon found in some ancient scroll? I don't know. But this demon Baron required the life of a child.
Yes. And this is when things escalate because up until this point, he said, you just have to do this to summon them. And then when those summonings failed, he did say, he requires this because he needs your trust, or he needs to be able to trust you, to know that you can do evil. He needs to know that he can give you attention for good reason, or evil reason, I guess. So they do this. They actually go and find an infant child, and they do murder the child and offer up parts of the child to summon this demon. And still, no demon comes around. So being heavily religious, we see Gilles de Rais is actually remorseful enough to bury the child in sacred ground. And this is interesting because, again, we see that there is this theme of his faith. Even though he's just committed this horrible act, he's still
leaning on the traditions of religion.
Yeah, he's definitely adhering to something here. Again, not very well, but it's a very interesting point in his life. So from here, things seem to be fully established. Whether the murder started with this infant child or after his grandfather's death, or whether they were happening back during the war, as he would confess in a trial later on, you have this building plot behind the scenes. He brings in 4 servants. Poitou and Henriette are 2 servants in particular that would kind of be his downfall later on. And then the 2 others are not necessarily servants so much as accomplices in the murders themselves. And those are Prelati himself, and then a man by the name of Roger de Brickville. I want to go back for a second and talk about Roger. He is actually a cousin of Gilles de Rais, and he first really came into...
Sounds so fascinating to have a Roger in the midst of all of these very lush and beautiful names. Gilles de Rais, Joan of Arc, Prelati, and then there's Roger.
believe that's
But who framed Roger?
English. Oh gosh, nobody actually. And that's an interesting point we'll get to.
Are you sure his name isn't pronounced Roger?
It may be a different pronunciation in French. That's the English translation of his name, and that's what I'm going with. But we'll call him de Brickville instead. So de Brickville was his cousin, and he was known for being a smaller person. He came into the House of Crayon when Gilles de Rais was actually still young, still a child, if you will. He and his family fled from the English during the 100-Year War. So there's a lot of turmoil going on in that instant. But what we see is that Gilles de Rais actually bullied de Brickville as a child. This caused de Brickville to hate him from an early age. So these 4 accomplices that Gilles de Rais surrounds himself with, Prelate and de Brickville kind of are in the background, pushing him on, egging him on in these killings, and they also take place in the killings themselves. But we see that Gilles de Rais quickly goes out of control, and as serial killers do, he escalates, whereas they are able to step away at times when needed.
Now let's talk about the murders, because the murders that we're talking about are primarily children and teenagers between the ages of 6 and 18.
And mostly boys.
Mostly boys. They were tortured, in just heinous ways, and murdered. And so we're not talking about just going out and picking off a few people here and there. We're talking about a habitual string of murders of children and teenagers.
Not just any either. He would only have the most handsome, the most beautiful children that he could find, and that he could have his servants bring to him.
And he would tell the children that he was just going to play. They were there to play. And his servants would take them off to a secluded location where then Gilles would strip them down naked and sometimes dismember them, sometimes hang them up by hooks and torture them and engage in activities that I really don't want to talk about here, but if you can just imagine the worst, that's where he went. And then when they were dead, or even sometimes dying, he would sit upon their chest and laugh at them and watch them die. And then some people have written that he would sit there and just admire the organs and the parts of the body that he dismembered. Just a really sick and twisted person at this point that had just completely gone off the rails.
This is why some people, again, I don't believe this claim because I believe there were others like him long before him, but some people bring up that idea that he was the world's first serial killer. It should also be noted he would do terrible things like take them off of the hook sometimes to comfort them for a bit before he put them back on the hooks, ultimately. In one of the more damning pieces of evidence given by one of his servants that was arrested with him, a lot of the boys would be murdered by decapitation after being tortured.
And usually with a short, double-edged sword, he would do this.
What he would have his servants do next was collect the heads, clean the heads up, and then he would have them placed on his mantle. And he would have his servants pick out the most beautiful head, basically. And then he would take the head, kiss it upon the forehead, and tell the head to pray for his soul, pray for forgiveness from God, basically. So, pretty sick individual.
Well, let me point out, folks, if you think our world is messed up and people are doing crazy things today, most people don't have anything on guys like this.
True. So, that's just the tip of the iceberg in that section of his history.
Yeah, and usually the bodies would be cremated or buried somewhere. He would actually dispose of them. He wouldn't just leave them out as evidence.
Yeah, and it was in 1438, I think, that he had already moved on to a different location at this point, and discovered nearby were 40 naked children that had been buried in that location.
So in the midst of all this, around 1440, Gilles de Rais abducted and murdered a priest. This caught the attention of a bishop who then investigated de Rais, and he found the 40 bodies that you speak of that were buried. And this led ultimately to the trials.
And before we get to that, it should be noted that a lot of anecdotal evidence, a lot of folklore, if you will, people debate whether it is actual history or not, but a lot of folklore states that a lot of the people, the common folk, knew what was going on. Basically, that people had caught on to the fact that their kids were going missing. His servants would basically tell the common folk when they asked, where's my son? He was going to your castle. Where is he gone? Basically, they would give the story, well, he's over in this other town under this apprenticeship that Gilles de Rais acquired for him, or he's gone off to be a servant of the king, so you won't hear from him. It's why he left so quickly, because this was a great opportunity. They would spin a lot of tall tales in order to avoid questions, but people eventually did start to catch on. It was said even that the people in that castle, that Gilles de Rais and his servants would eat the children, that they were becoming something of cannibals. And you don't really ever hear of vampires or werewolves, but that was kind of where it was leading to, was that they were actually monsters of some sort. But you have this trial that does discover his heinous acts, and they start to find evidence of this going on. So they arrest Gilles de Rais, Poitou, and Henriette in 1440, I believe in August. And that is where the two trials start. And there are two separate trials. One is an ecclesiastic trial, and one is a secular trial. So it's very interesting. In the ecclesiastic trial, which is first, the bishop makes his case. And it is only after the threat of torture and the threat of excommunication that Gilles de Rais confesses. This is where a lot of people see it as pretty damning evidence. He does not only give the confession that they are searching for, he actually goes in and he gives more detail than anybody asked for. He gives so much detail that it fills in years and years worth of information. According to his confession, the first assault on children started around the early 1430s, before he actually left the war officially. Before this, I think Henriette and Poitou had already given their statement, which give a lot of the details that we see of Gilles de Rais that we know today, of him sitting on children's stomachs as they're dying and laughing and giggling. A lot of that vicious, almost maddened imagery that we have. So obviously he's sentenced as guilty. The secular trial that goes on is of particular interest because we move away from the religious trial going on to more of the trial of the crimes themselves. And his defense attorney, if you want to call him that for back then, basically makes a plea for insanity. Although he goes into a bit of the supernatural as well, saying, you cannot blame this man. He's not in control of his faculties. The devil is at work here. He makes a pretty good case, but nobody wants to hear it. And he is sentenced to death by fire. His servants are given the same sentence. And so what happens is they are hanged while being torched alive as well. Interestingly enough, Gilles de Rais' body is taken out of the fire when he's finally dead, where his servants are left in the flames to be burned to ash, and they are later scattered around to the winds.
And a lot of people believe that these trials were themselves very dramatic and believed to be pumped up a bit for political reasons, and that de Rais was framed in a lot of things that he did, and he was used as a pawn in a much larger political and religious game. Remember also during this time that it was very easy to cross the lines of religion and politics. Those two held hands fairly well during this era. So it wasn't difficult for the religious to dip into the political, and it wasn't difficult for the secular trial to dip into the supernatural or the religious, and all come to the same place in condemning this man and his servants. What I find really interesting is at his execution, Gilles de Rais was given an opportunity to share his final thoughts, and that's where he gave a sermon, almost as though he were in church on a Sunday morning preaching to the people. And basically his sermon admonished people to live a life in submission to God and faithful service of the church, and even spoke directly to parents to protect their children and raise their children right, and for people to care for one another. These were his final words before being hanged, burned, and then buried.
Yeah, and he went on as well saying, don't lavish your children like my father lavished me. Don't give them everything that they wanted.
Don't install jade floors.
Yeah.
In your
he
homes.
gave the same thing that you gave. So, but it was very interesting that he showed this consciousness. He showed regret for his actions, even though he couldn't stop himself That's what a lot of people point out, is that he showed that he still had a moral compass. He was just unable to follow it because of how far down the rabbit hole he went.
Well, let's make a point, too, that going back before the trial, it wasn't the kidnapping, the torture, the sexual abuse, the murder of dozens, if not hundreds of children, some say thousands, because like you said earlier, and like we talked about in earlier episodes of this series, those children were considered property of the state, so to speak. They had very little value. It was the kidnapping of the priest that led to his trial and the investigation and the trial and his death. So in its own twist of insanity, the way this was brought about was just nuts.
Yeah, it's pretty infuriating if it's true. And that's okay. So before we get into the different theories,
right?
I do want to go back and visit Roger de Brickville, or Roger, or
Roger. I'm going to go back to
I
Roger.
Can't speak much for Prelati. He's a little hard to find information on, so I don't know where he went during these trials. But remember, Prelati and de Brickville were accomplices, as well as Henriette and Potu, the latter two of which died in fire along with their master. I'm not sure where the former priest went, but Roger de Brickville basically wrote a letter to the king saying, don't blame me for this. I was young. I was smaller. I was kind of bullied into this by Gilles de Rais. And the sad thing is, although he was thought to be one of the ones that was egging Gilles de Rais on most of the time and kind of getting him further into this mess, he was also one of the people who kept on basically supporting Gilles de Rais in his reckless spending of money. But he was believed. That letter kind of got him off scot-free, and he was not convicted of any crimes. So kind of an interesting point in this case of who was not brought to trial.
Yeah, so don't install jade floors and learn to be a good letter writer.
Yeah, actually.
And you'll go far in life.
Apparently. So now we get down to the brass tacks of questions. The other thing we didn't mention before we get into the debating part, I guess, is that a lot of people attribute Gilles de Rais being the first Bluebeard, or the story upon which Bluebeard is based. As we talked about in the Tilly Clemec episode, Bluebeard was a fairy tale in which a man by the name of Bluebeard murdered his wives one by one as they got too nosy, or as he became jealous that they might have had other lovers. And in that story, the final wife sometimes gets away. Now, as a lot of people have pointed out, the idea that Bluebeard comes specifically from Gilles de Rais probably isn't completely accurate, but the specific version of Bluebeard that most people go to, the author of that fairy tale did base him off of Gilles de Rais. You see in that story the wives being hung on hooks, a lot of the bodies being thrown into moats or otherwise incinerated or disposed of directly from the historical account of Gilles de Rais' victims. So that is an interesting point, or just a tidbit. But we have a lot of people that say that Gilles de Rais is innocent.
Well, right, but let's also give the scope. Some people believe he only killed a few. I think some numbers only listed as 6 to 8 murders. Some list it as dozens. Others listed as hundreds. There are some accounts that attribute almost 6,000 murders to his hands. I find that to be quite a stretch. You murder 6,000 people back then, you probably just took out a country. So I'm not sure that that is completely accurate, but I might say that based on what we know and what we've read, probably in the dozens, possibly hundreds, depending on which accounts you put together. But the man was crazy by all accounts and really tipped the scales, both from a religious extremist standpoint and a political standpoint. But like you said, we have people that believe he was innocent, 100% completely framed, and no evidence tying him to these atrocities whatsoever.
Yeah, there are some people that point out that, and I have to address this by saying that the servants had specifically stated that they threw bodies in the moat, they incinerated the bodies and, disposed of the remains later. You have those 40 bodies found in a ditch somewhere, but There is an author who brought up the fact that in Gilles de Rais' actual castles, in his homes, you never find any bones or any teeth, any physical remains to this day. There's no evidence of bodies being there.
No heads of children on mantles.
Yeah. And as well, very similar to Bathory again, you never have anybody other than the servants who are confessing, probably under torture again, that can say that they ever saw any of the deeds actually carried out, or any dead bodies for that matter. So he goes on this case saying that a lot of this is anecdotal, that this is more folklore than actual history. Based on that and the writings of another writer, an author who claims that Gilles de Rais is actually part of a Dianic witch cult, you have a lot of people questioning whether or not he actually did any of these things. And the witch cult, I want to say real quick, a lot of historians kind of take that to court, no pun intended, and debunk that, if you will. But this claim of innocence was strong enough, and the case that was built was strong enough that in 1992, we actually see an interesting turn of events.
Yeah, in 1992, we have the equivalent of the Supreme Court in France, the High Court, basically, who exonerates Gilles de Rais. This many centuries later, based on the evidence brought forth by these authors that there is no real link to Gilles de Rais, and everything that is brought against him is either false or can't be connected to him. So this guy's cleared of these crimes.
But this is only really ever mentioned in France, and it's not until recently that some authors who happen to be able to speak and read French have actually written on the subject in English. So this is not something that was widely known until now. It still begs the question whether or not he did actually do anything at this point. Again, as with Bathory, it's probably not to the extent that some people say. Similar to Bathory, he was actually said to be, bathing in blood. And I feel like a lot of that is over the top, killing 6,000 kids. I feel like that's a little bit exaggerated.
Yeah, a little bit much.
But a lot of evidence, I think, still points to these events actually taking place.
So we have a guy who lost his parents, raised in a hostile almost environment, being taught to be a bully.
And yet having a good base of education.
Very strong education, very intelligent, and then going on to become a military hero, personal protector of Joan of Arc and the court of the king, and amassing vast wealth and properties, public life of faith that in that day contradicted with a lot of his other lifestyle, but he goes on to build this church, ends up selling properties and starting to sell some of the very things that he gave to the church in order to support his lifestyle, having that cut off, and in the midst of everything else going on in his life, begins to murder children, among other things, is hanged and burned and then buried. His servants are burned. And then fast forward several centuries, and people say he didn't do any of it. There are bloated stories of his numbers of murders, but then, like you said, a lot of the evidence points to the fact that a lot of this did happen. Not as bad as many have said, and probably not as innocent as some in modern history are claiming to be, but do we really know? How can we really tell?
It's a good question. We're talking about all of these serial killers this month. I've gotten into...
Wait a second. Don't tell me you're talking about all these serial killers this month. What? Might be careful with your next statement.
I've gotten into the Netflix show Mindhunter. That's
all
I was going to say.
All right. Scared me there for a second.
I've always had an
interest. About to walk out of this studio.
I've always had an interest in these topics, so it's been something that I'm naturally inclined to read about.
Naturally inclined to
read about.
Okay, clarify. Be loud and clear about that.
Now, the interesting thing is,
we're going back to talk about folklore monsters next month because you're getting a little bit too deep with this stuff.
It's interesting that he shows a lot of traits that our modern ideas of serial killers display. The troubled upbringing, the high intelligence, the charisma, but also the recklessness, specifically in battle, and later on, recklessly throwing away a lot of money and continuing to escalate in these violent murders. He displays this moral compass that he still has. which, interestingly enough, a lot of serial killers still show a lot of disdain for their own actions or a lot of regret later on. They'll speak about it almost without emotion, still registering a sense of regret in what they've done and wishing that they knew why they had done it. You almost have a similar portrait being told here. So all in all, kind of an interesting case study. And I don't know, I wish history was a little less muddled. But I guess being in the 1400s, we can only learn so much.
Listen, we can't unmuddle our own modern history, much less something from the 1400s.
That is very true.
And I think it's only going to get worse. So I think just taking on what we do have, this definitely was a guy who could be considered a monster. You know, and like we've said before, whether it's 1 or 100, 1 is too many. Some of the things that are attributed to his name and to his hands are just some of the most horrific acts that you can read about. Like I said at the beginning of this, there's no shortage of horror, you know, when reading about this man's life. And it's very true about Gilles de Rais. Every monster was first a man. Folks, we hope that you have enjoyed this series, and we've enjoyed hanging out with you. If you have any thoughts or want to share any more insights about these topics or any of the topics that we cover, just contact us at themonsterguys.com or on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram at themonsterguys. Again, as we said at the beginning of the show tonight, we're going to take next week off officially. It's Halloween week. Everybody be safe, have fun, share and share alike, be nice to the little children out there. We will come back in November with some very interesting conversation with some very cool people. And some of you know who I'm talking about with Ellie Haskin of Encounters Cast, and you've been waiting for a couple of months to finish this conversation with her, and I promise you won't be disappointed. So get ready for that. In the meantime, thank you again for the privilege of chatting with you. I'm DC.
And I'm Michael.
And I'm signing off. Good night.
Good night. Happy Halloween.